Today's video is on aggregate demand. It's about 50 slides, so I'm gonna have to go a bit fast. I might even skip over some of the less important slides so we can get to the big stuff. So the big thing about aggregate demand is how to calculate it. You'll notice it's exactly the same calculation as for GDP, right? Cigarette X M. Now, although they are the exact same calculation, they're not the exactly same thing. GDP is the actual output, whereas aggregate demand is a total planned spending. So that's a big difference there. One is what's actually transpired. The other is what is predicted to be spent. Now, if you look at this figure here, this downward sloping AD curve is quite similar to what you saw with the demand curve for micro, but there's a few things that are a little different. If you notice over here, the y-axis, it's not price, right? It's price levels. So this is all the prices, everything in society, from medicine to cars to piece of paper to iPhones, etc. And over here too, we're not talking about quantity, but we're talking about real GDP. So everything included, how much is the GDP? And remember here, real means it's taking into account inflation. So first, there's three reasons why it's negatively sloped, and there's three things to know here. I memorize it as WIN, the wealth effect, interest rate effect, and net balance. So wealth effect is when price levels are low, people are willing to spend more money. They feel wealthier. The second is interest rates. At low interest rates, people are willing to spend more money, and therefore demand goes up as well. And finally, the last but not least is the net balance effect, where if we are able to export more things because goods are cheap in our country, that shifts aggregate demand to the right. If you remember back to the equation, cigarette X M, right? X minus M. X is exports, M is imports. Greater exports is greater for GDP, because remember, exports are injections, whereas imports are leakages. Now, let's talk about each of these, C, I, G, and XM. So we'll start with consumption. So consumption could shift to the right or left. So the first thing I want to talk about is consumer confidence. Consumer confidence, when people feel good about the economy, they're going to spend more. So what makes people feel good about the economy? You have things like unemployment. When unemployment is low, right, everyone's friends have a job, their brother has a job, their dad has a job, they're feeling good about the future, they're going to spend more money. They're going to on just consumer goods. And vice versa, right? Oh, I have 8 good friends, and one just got fired last month, another just got fired 6 months, and a few of them are worried they're going to get fired next. In those situations, people are going to get more conservative when it comes to consuming goods. Now, keep in mind with unemployment, you should know 4 types. The most important is frictional and structural, because these are the two that we consider when there's full employment. There's still the 5% who are not working because of these two things. One is frictional, which is short term. So like someone, I just quit my job last month, I'm starting it next month. That's frictional. Structural is when there's mismatch of skills and jobs. So for example, we're seeing that happening right now with AI, where people have certain jobs that are certain skill sets, and if they don't match the type of jobs available, they're not working. So usually that's about 4 to 5%. The two lesser important types of unemployment that you may or may not need to know, but definitely know frictional and structural, is cyclical and seasonal. Cyclical means, if you remember the peaks, if you remember the booms and busts, right, of business cycle, in the same way you should know when the seasons change, certain jobs go up and down. Like a good example is the beaches, right? The beaches might have better businesses in the summer than they do in the winter. So again, what's ideal unemployment? As I mentioned a second ago, I think 4.5%, about 4 or 5% is what's ideal. Remember, everything is good in moderation, right? You'd think 0% unemployment is good, but it's actually not. 0% unemployment is bad for business, because then they don't have anyone else to hire, right? That's why Japan, for example, that 2.5% is actually not that amazing. It means that Japan is kind of lacking in workers in general, whereas the UK, Saudi is kind of a good place. Spain, that's too high. Now, real interest rates. So when interest rates are low, people can borrow more money. They're going to pay for things. Housing's a great example, because houses are so expensive. So when something's as expensive as a house, it makes a big difference when the interest rate is 3% versus 10%, right? If it's 3%, much cheaper, I'm willing to make that, $500,000 purchase. 10%, I might be like, I might wait a little bit. Wealth. So wealth affects interesting one here where when people's assets go up, right? Things like property, bonds, stocks. So this is different from income, right? Income is what you are getting at a monthly or bi-monthly rate from your company. Wealth is like, oh, the house in my price has gone up 10% in the last year. I feel wealthy. I'm going to go spend money. And vice versa, right? Let's say I think over here is like Louisiana. Your house goes down in 10% and it's gone down 15% in 2 years. Well, you're going to spend less money on your car. You might not update to the newest iPhone because you feel poor, right? Because your house has lost value. Another thing that plays a role is personal taxes. When people are taxed a lot, they don't spend as much. And when people are taxed less, they spend more, right? A great example of that is income tax. When income tax is lower, people are going to spend more on consumer goods. The last but not least is household indebtedness. So this is an interesting one. It's a tricky one because it slices both ways. So short term, it's actually good to have access to borrowing. This is why Americans spend so much freaking money, right? It's because Americans have access to credit cards. They can get loans even if they don't have any money. That lets them spend. But long term, it's bad because if people already owe $10,000, they already owe $20,000 in credit card loans, they're less likely to consume compared to the person with $0 in loans. There's one more. Future prices. So when we think prices are going to go up, we're going to buy it now. If we think prices are going to go down, well, we're going to wait. So this is very similar to what we learned in micro in first semester. Now, there's 5 things to look at. You'll notice a lot of this overlaps with the C's. For example, interest rates are the exact same thing, guys, as consumption. When interest rates are low, people are spending more in their business. When interest rates are high, they're spending less. Business confidence, you could just replace the word consumer with business. So business confidence, for example, businesses see that all the rooms in the building are taken up. That's a good sign, right? That all the businesses are booming, or the stock market and so forth. And the business confidence is high, businesses are spending more money. Technology, when there's innovation that helps companies grow, that's going to reduce costs and it's going to help businesses aggregate demand shift to the right. Business taxes, so again, very similar to consumers. Businesses also get taxed, like corporate tax. When corporate tax is low, they're going to spend more money. Corporate tax is high, they're spending less money. A good example is in 2017, Trump had tax cuts for corporations that helped corporations spend more. So the I went up. Finally, level corporate indebtedness. It's the exact same deal with the consumer side. It's good if businesses have access, right, to being able to borrow money. But once businesses borrow money, that means their aggregate demand curve will shift to the left because they already owe money, which means it's less likely they're going to borrow even more money. Now, keep in mind, investment in the economy does not refer to the investment in the stock market. So this might be getting a little too much in detail, but I think it's worth touching upon. So when firms invest, we're talking about they're paying wages, they're buying extra land, right? They're creating new jobs. If a business simply just does a stock buyback, so for example, Apple bought $85 billion of their stocks, that's not helping the people get paid more, right? That's not helping their business, like their factories grow. So stock buybacks do not lead towards aggregate demand shifting to the right. Government is actually just one slide, if I remember right. Yes, just one slide. Government, one word you should know, it's actually not on the slide, is austerity. So when governments don't spend money, it shifts to the left, it's austerity. And when government spends more on things, they're going to spend more on building a road, they're going to build a stadium, they're going to pay military contractors more money, all that shifts to the right. Finally, exports and imports. Exports, remember, are injections because your products are going out, but money is coming in. Some countries rely more on exports than others. Now, what's very interesting with exports and imports is if your exports are higher, you have a trade surplus. If your exports are lower, you have a trade deficit. Keep in mind, if you have an export surplus, that's a positive, so your GDP goes up. If you have a trade deficit, your GDP goes down. So two extremes here that I want to briefly touch upon. China has a pretty strong trade surplus, so their exports versus imports is one way they greatly improve their GDP. To the contrary, we have the United States that's in a trillion, that's with a T, dollar. Oh, sorry, that should be debt, right? The U.S. imports tremendously, and therefore they are in debt in comparison to countries like China. Now, keep in mind, again, I'm just going to go over the big points here, that income of trading, this is actually big, we should go over it. Income of trading partners does matter. What I mean by that is, let's say the U.S. and Canada are huge trading partners for you, and they go through a serious economic crisis, and their dollars become worth, and their Canadian dollars become worth very little. Well, in that case, let's say I'm Japan and Canada and U.S. are great clients. If the U.S. dollar and Canadian dollar get weak, for Americans and Canadians, it's going to be harder to buy Japanese products. Therefore, it will slow down the Japanese market as well. So keep in mind, in this global market we live in, for macro, that includes exports and imports, it's not just your own country, right? Who you also get money from makes a tremendous difference. I already talked about this, so I'm not going to go over it, but I will fix the spelling. Let's keep going on here. I think this is the last big point, is exchange rates. So exchange rates impact the price of goods in a country. Please remember, as the interest rate goes down, a currency gets weak. And when a currency gets weak, two things happen. It's harder for me to go abroad and buy stuff because my currency is weak. So it's hard for me to import. And it becomes easier for me to export because my currency is so weak. And vice versa. If the interest rate is high, now my currency is strong, so I can buy from other countries, but it's going to be hard to sell my stuff. Now, the point I'll leave with you here is that, remember, there's no magical solution, right? Every country has their own policies. A great example is China versus the USA, right? China's happy with their weak currency and able to ship and send things out to other countries. The U.S. is actually happy with the strong dollar because when the dollar is strong, it allows Americans then to buy Toyotas for cheaper. It allows Americans to, for example, if they want to buy, what should we talk about? Let's say they want to buy Samsung TVs. It's easier, and so forth. So remember, there's no magical bullet here for what exactly is the perfect model. Finally, last things to consider, and this kind of connects a lot more to global stuff that we'll get into next year. But keep in mind things about trade, right? We've been seeing tariffs a lot in the news. This is why it's really important to know stuff like tariffs, right? That's taxes countries have to pay when they are exporting to another country. And the importing country makes that money. Keep in mind, some countries just have restrictions on volumes. So they say, look, we'll trade with you, but only to a certain amount. Finally, some countries will just help fund their own domestic industries so they can fight off foreign investments, right? Foreign companies. And I think on that note, that's it. That was a rather long one, but I think important one. Aggregate demand.